Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today with two artists whose work I've been interested in for a long time, Mark Dion and Alexis Rockman. For the past 3 decades, both of these artists have addressed the relationship between nature and Western civilization in their work, and both have researched specific histories and regions. They've collaborated on several publications and a future exhibition, but their independent practices differ significantly. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to them together and to hear them talk about the works that each has selected for today. You'll see a kind of rotating PowerPoint of images go by that will touch on directly or indirectly. Both of these artists are, their reputations precede them, but just to give us a quick refresher, Mark Dion creates on-site installations from scavenged objects and images. He examines where our ideas about the natural world come from, the ways in which dominant ideologies and public institutions shape our understanding of history, knowledge, and nature. His work has been exhibited widely. I most recently saw his exhibition Follies at Storm King Sculpture Park in 2019. He's a professor at Columbia University. Alexis Rockman is a New York City-based artist who has blended science with informed speculation to deliver a prescient and at times apocalyptic vision of the ecological state of the planet. Relying on scientific as well as historic content, Alexis paints his vision of the collision between civilization and nature, and his subjects have ranged from the Great Lakes to the golf course. He shows us fantastical, catastrophic visions of the world we live in, and somewhat imagined as the wasteland of a post-human dystopia. Eerily reminiscent of what it feels like to walk around New York in the last couple of weeks, but I'm going to try not to think about that too much. So I wanted to begin thinking about you both going back to being students at the School of Visual Arts. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the circumstances that brought you together and whether your shared interests were evident to you from the get-go.
Alexis, you want to start?
Sure. I kept hearing rumors about Mark and what he was up to from a number of friends, and it took a little while for us to meet, but when we first met, I was just so happy that there was someone else in the world that had the peculiar interests that seemed kind of incongruous. I remember opening his notebook and there was a picture of Ray Harryhausen and Stephen Jay Gould on the same page, photographed, so I knew we were off to a good start. That was around 1988.
And it was similar for me. I saw Alexis's work about town, and at the same time, I really didn't know how much he knew about the references the work was making. So he was very much mining the history of visual culture of nature, and I just didn't know the level of his intentionality until we actually got face to face, and then realized that he actually knows what he's doing and knows a lot about what he's doing. And that we shared this enthusiasm for the history of science, the history of natural history, for wildlife conservation, so in that very initial meeting, we just began to make plans to travel together, to see things together, to go to museums together. It was a kind of just a great opportunity to meet a kindred spirit.
I remember when we met, you said you were going to be in Paris, and I had a plan to be in Paris, and you introduced me to the Jardin des Plantes and Cuvier, who I heard something about, but you were so involved with an installation about the history of taxonomy that it was just great fun.
I think it's wonderful to hear because, of course, your practices are in practice quite different, and yet they do share a certain amount of overlap in terms of message, if not in terms of medium. Mark, you've described your practice as holding up a mirror. And I love how you talk about the potential for art to include things that maybe we don't find in science, like humor and irony. Can you just talk about that a little bit? I mean, how does that sort of inform your entry into the actually very difficult and timely issues that you work on?
Yeah, I think Alexis and I are part of a community of artists who really think about the culture of nature and are devoted to expanding sort of the landscape genre and the way artists have engaged in nature and the questions of nature and our relationship with other animals. And you could trace that right back in an unbroken chain, right, to cave painting, right? And the other artists also share this kind of deep focus and concentration. You know, I think for myself, I've learned a lot from natural history display. I've learned a lot from the culture of science, and we spend a lot of time, both Alexis and I spend a lot of time with scientists, with exhibition designers, with historians of science, and we know that we are not the same thing. You know, the art that we're making is not science, and it's not scientific illustration, but it is very much allied with science. It's allied with science, you know, even in the simple way that we have the same enemies, right? Fundamentalism, closed-mindedness, prejudice, and we're very vigilant in how ideology kind of sneaks into the cracks of scientific practice, and how social agendas can find their way in science. And so part of I think our mission is to kind of tease some of those things out, but to use a toolbox, you know, I mean, things that we have access to, things that scientists don't have access to, irony, metaphor, we can make, we can use anthropomorphism productively.
Yeah.
Alexis, do you think that your work has moved closer to science? I'm thinking about, for example, the Great Lakes cycle, which are really specific to that region and very carefully researched.
I took on the responsibility of trying to develop relationships with scientists when I was approached about a commission at the Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, and it was for, I also had in mind that a lot of scientists were going to see it. So when I started to develop that project, which was a map of the world with human-induced extinctions, like a greatest hits of terrible things wherever humans have gone, they brought with them, you know, invasive species, plants and animals, rats, and so on. I started to cultivate a relationship with the Department of Fisheries. I was also reading a book by David Quammen called Song of the Dodo. And as I learned more and more about where we were headed, the more I felt a sense of responsibility to take on, and this was around 1997, take on this I guess it's a burden, and it's been, I mean, a complete and utter failure, frankly, because we're really in much worse shape than we've ever been. And that was really sort of, that brought me to Manifest Destiny, which I started in 1999, which is imagining New York City after climate change had melted a lot of the ice caps. And I worked with James Hansen and Cynthia Rosenzweig at NASA and Columbia University to sort of inform. There were about 30 people I worked with. And it was really a call, it was an alarm. I was very concerned that, you know, we weren't going to, you know, do anything in time. And unfortunately, I was right. And I remember the irony and the anger I had when the show opened at the Brooklyn Museum, Manifest Destiny, and later that week, The Day After Tomorrow premiered, which was a preposterous piece of, you know, garbage, in spite of some interesting tidal waves going over Manhattan, which really made a joke out of these issues and really didn't help this tremendous crisis that we're in. And then, of course, Al Gore came out with An Inconvenient Truth a couple of years later. So it's been ongoing since then.
I find it actually, it's quite interesting. I know you've both commented on it in other interviews that you've given, but there's obviously been a great burst of many artists who are using their platforms as artists to express their concern for the environment in one way or another, either through solution-based work or raising awareness or showing a dystopian or a sort of utopian types of images. And both of you began doing this well before much of the work that's being generated now. And I wonder, do you feel that the rise of environmentally concerned artwork on the contemporary art sort of cycle in fairs, galleries, even to a certain extent in museums, has that given a sort of new impetus to what you're doing? Do you feel like it's a good thing to be joined by many other types of voices?
I absolutely think that it's critical that some of the work that we've done have spawned other voices, but also we didn't invent this as well. We were looking at other artists, we were looking at people, very seriously interrogating the Hudson River School, the earth art tradition, and we're really interested in artists who are expanding the earth art tradition now. I was very influenced by Merrill Euclides, for example, and but I feel like it's true that there are all of these artists engaged in this practice, but I don't feel like we still don't really have a voice. It's very rare that we're actually put together in a very prominent place. There have been so few exhibitions on artists' relationship to climate change, to the biodiversity crisis. These things happen in small places, but there hasn't been a major museum committed to thinking about these issues in a long time.
Well, it's definitely going to be time. I've been noticing in my own research, I know I've been working a little bit with the NRDC. They have an artist in residence, Jenny Kendler, whose work I admire a lot. I recently had a great conversation with someone at the Audubon Society who's also interested in beginning to work much more closely with artists in a kind of partnership. I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about your art science types of partnerships. How reciprocal are these relationships? Do you feel that you're able to, in some ways, help scientists in their work as their work can inform yours? Because I know that from the scientific community, places like the NRDC and the Audubon Society are very much looking to a kind of reciprocal relationship, feeling that the processes of science and art may not be so different and that both can learn from each other.
Mark, do you mind if I?
No, please, go ahead.
I have had just nothing but generous and overwhelmingly positive experiences with scientists. Even rejection letters were very generous. E.O. Wilson. To have someone like Stephen Jay Gould write about my work when I was forming my ideas was tremendously encouraging, to say the least. And since that was in the early 90s, to have every project I've done that's been major or an institutional project, I've had just an incredible exchange with scientists from the Great Lakes Cycle. There are a couple of people that just would bend over backwards to help me, and I hope I was helpful to them, but I can't really speak to what I bring to the table for them. I just incredibly generous on their part, answering questions ad nauseum, from down to like the invasive species in the Great Lakes, and is that larvae, what jellyfish larvae is it? Stuff like that.
That's amazing.
Crazy stuff I could never answer myself.
Yeah, I think it's important that the scientists also understand that we're not there to illustrate their proposals and their work and their research, and that what we do bring to the table is some kind of experience of working with very complex information and presenting things in ways that are not definitive. There are things like ambivalence and ambiguity and contradiction that art can express in very powerful ways. These are things that I think are difficult for scientists to speak with. And I think what's really important is to understand that in the same way that I don't think about myself as an environmental activist, I think I'm very allied to environmental activism, and that I learn a lot from it, and I think some of what I do can be helpful toward that activism, but I don't really see myself as an activist per se, in the same way I don't really see myself as working in the service of science in the same way. And also, I think both Alexis and I are so keenly interested in the history of science. We do bring that historical perspective because the history of science is full of injustice and errors in judgment and ideology creeping in and pseudoscience. So we're also very critical and we bring that criticism into the work as well.
No, I like in both of your work as an art historian myself, I'm coming from the humanities trying to think what I can bring to the table. And I think the idea of signs of nature, ideas about nature, how we understand nature and the acceptance that as people coming from the humanities, as art writers or as artists, we aren't going to stand in for scientists. We're not there to make data more pretty and make it more appealing and so on. At one point, Bill McKibben had said that the scientists have done everything they can, and that it's up to the artists and writers, that, you know, the humanities, we're supposedly the great communicators, that it's up to us now to get people to understand. And I think that's not necessarily a responsibility that should be on an artist, but I wondered if either of you would comment on that.
I mean, I readily take that on, but you know, I'm aware of its shortcomings, but you know, I try to communicate ideas that I believe in, or scientific information, which you might in this world call facts. We deal with, you know, an administration every day that's, you know, pulling a fast one as much as possible, while the scientists are sort of off in the corner, and you know, we're desperate for information that'll save our lives. And the thing that I wanted to bring up about our moment with science is that, you know, and this is certainly not my idea, but it's something I definitely agree with. You know, what's happening with this virus that we're dealing with, it's unfolding and we don't know where it's going to end, is really a very accelerated version of climate change. We're going to see exactly the same failures structurally in terms of you know, governments and policy. We were totally unprepared for these issues, and this is just a small version of that. We need science more than ever.
Yeah, and I think that you know, art and the humanities play a role in that, and also a role, you know, policing science, because science does have such an important place in terms of the hierarchy of information in our society. It's also important that we are ever vigilant for how pseudoscience and ideology claiming to be science sneaks into that discourse. And so I think that's a really good place for art and the critical humanities to be.
Oh, I agree. Very well said. And I mean, that's exactly the intersection where I want to be working. And I think a kind of healthy skepticism and an understanding that science is as ideology driven as any other field is a very important place to start. I've been noticing in the last couple of weeks that on social media, people have been circulating photographs of clearer skies over LA, or the Himalayas that are now visible from 125 miles away, or waters in the Venice canals clearing. And there's been some kind of murmur that we're being able to see what the world could be if people would take the steps that climate change scientists have been asking us to change, and drive less and fly less and so on. And I wondered whether you had any sense about whether these images as visual representations of what could be, whether you think that that might have any kind of game-changing effect, like the opposite of apocalyptic imagery.
Well, I mean, they are apocalyptic imagery. That is inherently what they are. I think they're very deceptive, those images, and confusing to people. It's a type of, you know, utopian fantasy. You know, coyotes, civets in the street, dolphins in the canal, and so on, which I'm sure is a lot of fun to see, but that has nothing to do with the structural issues that we're facing. And, you know, you can see the Himalayas, but when the last glacier melts and Bangladesh has no fresh water, what's going to happen? So I think that those are just eye candy and not particularly helpful.
Well, I think that the interesting model is this is a kind of moment where the reset button has been pressed, and what kind of world we return to when things get back to so-called normal, if things get back to normal, is really up to us, and it's really difficult to imagine that this kind of dramatic change could happen overnight. But it has, and so that does show the potential to change if there is the desire to change, and if there's the leadership to change. And Alexis is right. We're going to have to apply the same rules to the coming situation with global warming and things getting much worse.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge overlap between climate change and public health and the uneven burden of distribution, the impact on communities. There's so many ways in which what's happening now overlaps with what environmentalists have been talking about: species loss, closer contact with animals, just all of the economic inequities of who gets more impacted. I think I understand what you're saying, Alexis, about the images being eye candy. Certainly they don't change anything on a structural level, but it does possibly make more real the understanding that we as humans are actually having an impact, and that we could change what that impact would be. And certainly the hope is that we don't go back to the same old, but that we actually go back to rebuilding things in a different way. And of course, it's very idealistic, but possibly visual representation, images can play a role in that. I think it's, as AOC says, you can't imagine it if you've never seen it. So possibly now we're seeing it.
Fair enough. But in the meantime, there's policy to sneak in the Keystone Pipeline.
Oh, absolutely.
Environmental rules have been rolled back in the last couple of weeks, and don't be fooled. I agree. I think it's good to see dolphins in the canal, but those things are not going to. If and when the economies start up again, there's going to be more of a sense of vengeance and momentum, and people will have, at least it'll be binary. On one side, you'll have voices that'll say now we know what it's like not having options, and the other voices will say we have to deal with climate change, and I unfortunately see a lot of inertia continuing.
Yeah, I mean, this does give us a peek at what I think a lot of people already know, which is that a lot of natural systems are extraordinarily resilient, right? And if you do give them a break, there is the possibility of things returning. And this works extremely well in cases where people have done things like create marine reserves and no fishing zones. And suddenly one finds that these ecosystems bounce back with surprising swiftness, right? Their potential is there. Is the will there? That's what it's really hard to say.
And I absolutely, and Alexis, I agree with you that there's the fear that in the name of economic reconstruction, terrible things will be done to the environment. I absolutely share that, and they're already being done.
It's writings on the wall.
Yeah, I recently, actually the conference was canceled, but I was meant to go to the University of York to present at an interdisciplinary conference on climate change communication, where each session was going to have people from the sciences and people like me giving papers on somewhat related topics. And it was all in the service of trying to communicate these issues to a non-specialist audience. And I wonder, for both of you, I think your art succeeds on multiple levels because it's very sophisticated and well-researched and ties into ideas and the history of art. But I wonder, when you are working on things, what also are you thinking about in terms of a non-specialist audience? Is that an important audience to you to reach?
For myself, I mean, it's important, not just in terms of issues in regard to the history of science and environmentalism, but in terms of art as well. I come from a very blue-collar family, and I would never imagine wanting to make a kind of art that would alienate a viewer who didn't have who would walk through a gallery door and not. I want everyone to be able to approach this work as something interesting and engaging, and I absolutely don't want to mystify, confuse, mislead, or make work that is just too dense for people to approach. Having a popular audience is an incredibly important part of my practice, and even if it expands some people's idea of what art can be, that's an important element of that for me. I
agree completely. I always imagine getting a delivery from something, FedEx or whatever, and what would the person that's not interested or familiar with art, what would be their take on it? Because part of, and I agree completely with Mark, and it's also, I mean, I can probably consider myself a bit more of an activist than Mark. I don't know what that means, but I also love the idea that what I'm doing will appeal to children and, you know, get them while they're young, so to speak, and, you know, get them engaged in some of these questions or ideas, or partially it may be frightening and it may be terrifying or enchanting or whatever. But I wanted to just answer one thing from your last question, Julie. You know, when a lot of things where you have a vacant lot and, you know, if you go to Hawaii, for instance, which is a fascinating place, I was invited to be a speaker at the Merwin Conservancy, which is on Maui, which is a beautiful place. So much of it looks superficially like it's in great shape and it's beautiful, but there's so much damage from, you know, centuries of invasive species and farming that you can look at an area and you can have basically a library of poems, which Merwin, W.S. Merwin, the great poet and environmentalist, collected, but they're also fighting off invasive species right next door to them. So the idea that these places will come back, which they will come back, but there's a, as Mark and I, Mark actually introduced me to this institutional practice of our selected species, invasive species, in the late 80s. I didn't know it was an academic practice. I was actually doing it more intuitively. And it's the idea that there's a global cast of characters that include viruses now, which are not really alive, bacteria, plants and animals, which include the ailanthus, the tree grows in Brooklyn, is actually from China, rats, Norway rats, which are really from China. So you have this global population of animals that'll do very well. So if you see versions of that, you can imagine that things are okay, and you look out the window and there's like green stuff, like kudzu, but it's not biodiversity. It's really a desert.
Right, right. Well, if ideally, as artists who are so knowledgeable about these things and have the public sphere, there could be an educational component that would help people to understand on multiple levels, to use the art as a catalyst for that kind of deeper understanding.
I think it's complex. In the early work that I did, including one of the pieces that is one of the images that we showed, the Under the Verdant Carpet, The Dream of Mount Koch, which is a work I made with my friend William Scheffrin. You know, we kind of thought that the biodiversity crisis, the extinction crisis, the tropical rainforest crisis, the waste crisis, that these were information crises, right? That these were real problems of people actually not knowing what the situation is. And I just think that we can't say that anymore, right? So this is not an information crisis. This is a crisis of will, in a sense. It's a crisis of
Ideology.
A vision. And so the early works that I did were extremely didactic. They really, I turned surfaces into blackboards and wrote things and presented data in a very direct way. And it took me a long time to understand that the environmental crisis is not a crisis of information. It's a different kind of crisis. It's more complex than that.
I was going to ask you to recite the 5 states of mourning that we had developed in about 5 years ago. Do you remember them more or less?
I don't actually.
Well, it has to do with Freud's theorem of grief about the environmental movement, but it was very funny / hashtag sad at the time.
Yeah. Well, I think in the end our work is very melancholy, and I think in some way early on we imagined that a very important aspect of our work was to inform and was to be somewhat didactic. And I think we both recognize now that a very important element of our work is a form of mourning, and it is a kind of form of grief, and that's really the status of the work. And I think that's an important thing for art to do. It's one of those things that art can do very well, is express loss and grief and melancholy.
Yes.
I think that absolutely makes a lot of sense. That as an educator myself, and I know, Mark, you are one, and inevitably in your work, Alexis, so are you. I think of didactic as something positive. Sometimes I think that there are lost opportunities when people show work that is well-researched and well-informed, not to take that opportunity to use it as a teaching tool. But I think that comes also with how it's framed in an institution. What kind of institution? Have you had different experiences with context, showing your work, say, in a natural history museum as opposed to an art context?
Do you want to say, Mark?
No, I mean, for me, I'm really fortunate to be able to work in collaboration with natural history museums, with oceanographic museums, even with zoos, and to work in the public realm. So I find that those are all really exciting and interesting places. And I don't think that Alexis and I in any way would deny the importance of didacticism in the work. I think we're both kind of committed to that. It's also the work that we look at and like as well, and identify with. But I think that those institutions, they bring a different kind of viewer, and I'm not especially concerned if people look at this stuff and say, and look at it with the idea that the art part is the first thing that should cross their mind. What's really important for me is that they have an interesting and challenging experience. And if they find out later they're actually looking at an artwork, that's the best for me. I don't want to foreground that this is an artwork. I want to foreground that this is something interesting and challenging to kind of confront, and it's a puzzle. Or I always think about my work as a sort of crime scene, and my viewer is the detective, right, who has to put together a sense of what's happened here based on the clues that I'm providing for them.
Yeah, I mean, I love that about your work. An interesting thing happened to me in 1993 when I was thrilled to be invited to show the biggest painting I'd ever made, Evolution, which isn't in the slideshow, which is 8 by 24 feet, at the Carnegie Museum. And as everyone probably knows, the Carnegie Museum is half art and half natural history. So, and I'd never been to Pittsburgh before. I was thrilled to be going. And the curator at the time, Richard Armstrong, said to me, well, this painting has a lot of interesting things in it. Why don't you do a didactic key? And I was so excited to do that. It took me about a month to go back and figure out what the hell I put in the painting, in terms of its specific species or whatever. But what that did was it opened a door to labeling things. And now virtually every large work I do has a key attached to it.
And do you think that that's a good thing, or something people can use if they want, or not use if they don't want?
I think it's crucial to the way I think about the world now. In no way does it remove the mystery of why the hell I chose to do it.
Absolutely.
So I think it makes it more interesting, I hope, because I'm more interested in specificity of naming things. But think it adds a lot.
Well, I like that about both of your work. I think it is very specific. Mark, I was watching something where you had gotten all the different fish and mollusks in Chinatown and put them in jars and identified them. And I just thought that act of figuring out what on earth is in all those bins, that it's a kind of wonderful taxonomy.
I don't know where Mark went, but I don't see him anymore.
Oh, I'm not here?
Oh, no, you lost your video.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know why that happened. Hold on.
I was actually with Mark when he was doing that in Chinatown. It was a riot. I mean,
I thought it was a perfect, having gone for years past those things, thinking, what's that slimy thing with 6 legs? I mean,
see a cucumber.
Am I on or not, Alexis?
No. I see it. I see a.
There you are.
Okay, sorry.
All right.
Okay, yeah, so that's a work actually from 1992, and a work that I did with for American Fine Arts, where I created 3 fictional bureaucracies, and their business was to organize nature. And I'm always suspicious of the way that artists can, in some way, grab authority by claiming the voice of science, right? I mean, science is the great authority in our society. If you can in some way masquerade as that, you've gained that authority somehow. So I wanted to do a piece that was really not about the mastery of that, but about showing how difficult it is. And so, you know, identifying fish is very hard for people who know what they're doing. So for me, I was really, you know, punching way above my weight and having to learn how to key out fish from Chinatown. And of course, Chinatown is an international market. So the organisms that are there are coming from all across the world. So one of the ways it helps to find out what an octopus is, what species it is to know where it came from. But when you get an octopus in China, you don't know if it came from the South China Sea, from the Atlantic, from the Pacific Northwest. So it's incredibly interesting and difficult. And I think part of the audience reaction, I'm hoping, is that they see that I'm struggling. They see that I'm failing as well as occasionally succeeding. That this is not taking on the mantle of scientific mastery. Rather, this is showing how difficult that is to do.
Do you think it'd be fair to say that it's more taking on the spirit of a scientific experiment?
Well, you know, I think science, one of the things that defines science is a very rigorous set of rules, right? And when you're outside of those rules, you're no longer science.
It's meaningless.
So you know, for me, that part of the construction of the space itself is already indicating that this is not science in a pure sense, but this is an experiment. Not all experiments have to be scientific experiments.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I had the opportunity at SUNY Stony Brook last year to give a talk to a group of students. Half of them were from the Environmental Sustainability Institute there, and the other half were studio art majors. And at the end of the talk, a kid from the science department raised his hand and asked whether I could put him in touch with an artist because he didn't know how to draw well and he had a lot of information and he wanted an artist to help him put it out there. And I thought from a science perspective, it was a kind of wonderful question. You know, it was some understanding that there needs to be some kind of partnership there. From an art side, we can say we're not data illustrators, we're not here to make data art. But from a science point of view, I think, yeah, even Mark, what you're describing with the fish, I mean, there is so much that you can make that specific. You can have a public place where people can learn about those things. You can open up questions about global supply chains. There's so many things that I think that those kinds of partnerships, whether they're hidden in the background or whether they're openly working together, can really be just a wonderful thing. And going forward, I feel like if the art community, for want of a better word, is going to have a significant role in thought leadership, meeting those interdisciplinary opportunities halfway is going to just continue to be more and more important. And I think both of you have really set great examples for that. And I know you'll continue. Before we finish and open the floor up to questions, I wonder whether you feel like holding forth at all about how you see the foreseeable future, what you hope is going to happen. You don't have to answer that question. I know myself, I'm kind of on the one day at a time plan.
It's like a fool's errand. I pass.
Okay. Understood.
I think it is really difficult to imagine. You know, it's in terms of the things that I think Alexis and I are really interested in: biodiversity, forests, and oceans, and coral reefs. There's very little good news coming, and you know, I live in hope that that things could turn around and that there's the will to turn it around, but I can't really see that happening.
Well, I'm of the possibly naive belief that if we all use every platform that we have, that will reach somebody. And I feel like that's our very wonderful privileged role right now in the art world, is just to try to build those bridges. And I think both of you have just set an amazing example in that direction.
Well, we're certainly not going to give up the fight.
No, no, not for a minute. Not for a minute. I think if we're ready, I think we could open the floor up to questions.
Great. Thank you all so much for that conversation. Lots of thoughts. I think everyone also has lots of thoughts here. The chat was super active. I want to start, I want to go to Jennifer Calkins for the first question. Jennifer, I'm going to unmute you if that's okay.
Oh, uh-oh.
Oh, there you are.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm asking, so I ask my question now?
Yes.
So I'm interested, first of all, I love both of these artists' work, and it's been a very important, your work has been very important to me. I'm a biologist, a writer, and a lawyer, actually, and I have kind of traveled, you know, I find your work is something that's really helped me be in the world of all of the things that I'm experiencing that I don't, I'm not, anyway, thank you, I'm not articulating that well. The question I have, though, is the term invasive species. And I'd like a little interrogation of that, because I, as somebody who's studied ecology and evolutionary biology, a concern I have is that we label things invasive species very easily, and then that creates a moral, sort of a way for us to engage morally that lets us off the hook. And so this is something that I feel like we need a fundamental reframing anyway, and part of that involves interrogating our own relationship to these species. So I'd just be curious as to your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree that the way we're thinking about and talking about these things is evolving in a sense, and also that they're, you know, we can take many different examples of these kinds of organisms, and some of which are intensely pernicious and really suppress biodiversity, and some of which don't really. But we need to evolve our terms, and I do think that invasive species, or our selected species, or whatever we do want to call them, you know, they take a lot of heat for the stuff that we do, right? And it's not as though these things have jumped borders on their own. You know, all of these kinds of problems with our selected species are problems that are caused by us and by playing Russian roulette with global biodiversity.
Either intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
And, I mean, tell me a non-pernicious invasive species, and I'm sure it's an exception. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I see nothing but problems wherever I go with things that come from another part of the planet, pitching a ride, either intentionally or unintentionally, along with humans. So I guess I do have a sense of morality about it, which is, you know, obviously embarrassing on some level. But if you care about biodiversity, you can't have invasive species.
Is Jennifer there to follow up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, am I allowed to follow up? Yeah, I
I'd like
appreciate
to.
both of your responses. And I mean, especially, you know, the idea that what the impact of what we call invasives is a flattening of biodiversity. And so, you know, I'm still struggling at the place at which we decide what we are allowed to control.
Well, I think it's also like really clear that you know, when we're talking about the invasive species or our selected species, it's really clear that we're not metaphorically talking about people, right? And very often that this people are get concerned because that language sounds like the kind of language of xenophobia, right? And
Right.
I just think it has to be very clear when we're talking about plants and animals that rush into novel environments, dominate them, and suppress biodiversity, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're not talking about...
It's not a metaphor.
Yeah.
I guess one point I would like to make about why I think the thinking needs to be more complicated is I've worked on the issue of feral cats.
Uh-huh.
And cats are question they're a problem and they reduce biodiversity. But when you think of them as vermin or invasive without, what I see is sort of the rush to poison, trap, and shoot them. And that does not work. And so there is maybe one island where that's worked.
Yeah.
But we need a complexity of approach. And in order to have that, I think sometimes we need to rethink our relationship with that species.
If you want to have biodiversity, you can't have cats. That's not that.
But how do you get rid of them? That's the problem.
I've been sniper hunting with them in Tasmania. So,
but they're not gone. I mean, that's the problem, is they haven't been eradicated that way.
Yeah.
They're cute inside. They should not go outside.
And I agree with that, and I think they need to be removed from these places. But I did an analysis of what was happening with all these places where shooting and trapping was happening. And because of the way humans act, the cats keep coming.
Well, we're not letting humans off the hook in any way. This is obviously human induced. So we can go around in circles. I think we should move on.
I mean, just to say that it's absolutely true. I mean, we certainly have had all-out war on pest species like rats and mice and roaches, and it have made very little headway in hundreds of years.
They are us.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, for that question, and thanks for your answers both. We're gonna go to Brody next. Brody had a question about political influence. Brody, you there?
Hey, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, oh, cool. Hey, I'm Brody. I work at the United Nations, and so I'm very ignorant about arts in many ways. But basically, my question is, I've heard from a lot of colleagues, and I myself, I work on human rights issues. We write a lot of reports that are supposedly meant for policymakers, to advise governments and so on. I know colleagues at the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, who have written endless reports to pretty much an audience that isn't really listening to them. So I wanted to ask you, you spoke a little bit about the relationship between art and scientists. What about, I'd like to hear reflections on the relationship between artists and policymakers and government.
Alexis?
Look forward to that happening. Let me know when I have that opportunity. So
I think that's a really interesting question. The realm of art often does, it doesn't always bleed into other forms of culture and cultural production and decision making. And, that's a significant problem. I think that there's certainly the desire there. But I think often if you're unfamiliar with art, coming to it from other disciplines, it's easy to imagine it as a kind of panacea or a new way of engaging these issues that maybe has more power than it actually does. Oh, I'm not hearing.
I would agree with Mark there, but I noticed, for example, last year, the Union for Concerned Scientists, their Berkeley office, and they are policymakers, they had their first ever public art competition. And I know because they contacted me to see whether there was anybody I would recommend for it. And at the time I offered as, well, would you like an art person to maybe go over the proposals? I'd like to kind of see what's in there. They're, no, we're gonna do it ourselves. And it's fine, they chose an artist who I like very much. But I did have this feeling that they were in a little bit sort of grasping at a straw, that it wasn't really that well thought through. And I'm all for those kinds of partnerships, but I think they truly do need to be partnerships.
Great, thank you. Sue, oh, that's back to the invasive species things. Okay, for the next question, Aviva had a question about about art and science as well. Maybe Aviva, do you wanna ask about ask a question?
Sure, because as some of us know, there are a lot of artists, including myself, that are working on what Basarab Nicolescu described as the transdisciplinary in-between, because we believe that there's a way to work with one foot in science, one foot in art, and move forward into a new world. And without getting into anything polemical, I'm curious, it sounds as though Mark especially is dismissing the kind of work that comes out of that point of view as pseudoscience. And
No,
I think you have to credit your own insights, not to mention everybody else's.
I absolutely don't dismiss that kind of art, and you know, I mean, I think that in terms of, you know, I'm interested in an art that produces you know, a kind of new ethos toward thinking about the natural world. You know, I want art that promotes a kind of progressive culture of nature, and I throw my net very wide in terms of what I would consider that. And you know, it includes beautiful nature photography, it includes art that is activism, it includes artists who work in that interdisciplinary zone. I think we need all of these things. I'm just not that artist, but I don't discredit that form of art making. In fact, I champion all of these ways of building this progressive culture of nature. So I, you know, I think pseudoscience is a real thing. It's, you know, it's something that it is claiming to be science. It doesn't sound like that's the kind of art that you're making. You're making very clear, you know, you define it very clearly as an art and science collaboration, right?
I define it as art that comes out of a combination. We all of us working in this field work collaboratively.
Yeah.
But I'm also defining it as art that comes out of equivalent training, where
well, yeah, I mean, you know, to me, I don't see that as pseudoscience. Do you?
Well, that's why I was asking you to clarify.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Great, thanks, Aviva. Let's see, I'm gonna jump to Tom McGlynn had a question about irony. Tom, do you mind? I'm gonna unmute you.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Alexis. Nice to see you again. Yeah, I asked, I had the pleasure of interviewing Alexis in 2018, and I think we touched on this issue of like the persona of the artist being constructed in order for the work that subsequently comes from that construction. So I believe when I interviewed Alexis, I said that Mark's work seems to be coming out of an 18th century Enlightenment type of construction, and that your work, Alexis, was coming out of almost like an early 19th century Romantic, just stylistically, tradition. So would that be accurate?
I'd have to give that a lot of thought and go poke around and talk to you specifically about what you mean in terms of that era, but it's interesting.
Well, I guess just to reframe the question, I guess what I'm asking is that is there a sense of irony in the construction of the persona of the artist in both work?
I mean, for me, absolutely. You know, I think Mark Dion, the character who is the artist, who is not really who I am in a way. So, you know, right now I have a large exhibition at the Ammon Carter Museum, which no one is seeing, in Fort Worth, Texas, which involved my tracing the roots of 4 Yankees who went to Texas in the 19th century and mostly had a terrible time. So I followed their route in a kind of, in a sort of ironic way, making fun of the notion of, you know, people tracing the pathways, reenacting these things. And I did it in a way where I'm sort of intentionally misunderstanding what I'm seeing, in the sense that I'm taking a sort of ethnographic approach, but a a sort of falsely naive ethnographic approach in some cases. So for me, it is very ironic, and it is about constructing a character who has my name and is an artist, but is not actually entirely me.
So you're professionally adopting the persona of an amateur.
Yes.
And to answer I mean, I can't give you a specific, early 20th century. Did you say early 20th century?
No, I was thinking about like this, just the specific style of your work. Like there's this romantic element to it.
I've always been much more, democratic and kleptocratic in terms of the like what the paintings are coming out of Chesley Bonestell to Martin Johnson Heath. I'm omnivorous in terms of things I'm referencing. So I jump around centuries pretty readily in terms of what I'm thinking about. But I wanted to talk a little bit about irony, and that, for instance, if I do projects about geographic places that actually started with Mark when we were in Guyana in '94, when I had run out of a pencil and there was nothing to draw with, and Mark jokingly said, "Why don't you use some mud to make a work like Richard Long, but make it of something pictorial?" And the joke, that'll be hilarious. That became a body of work where I've done it in maybe 10 places. So, but one of the things I wanted to mention is it's very democratic. It can be the rat that lives in the sewer, or it could be, the very exotic thing that lives above it. There's no hierarchy in these things, and they're made out of material that are taken from that environment, and they become really a sort of record, almost like a diary of that place as an experience. Made out of exclusively that material: mud, soil, sand, bark, wombat poop in Tasmania, and so on.
So maybe I was thinking about that in terms of like a 19th century like animism.
I cuddle with some poop.
I mean, I think irony is really one of the sort of the bread and butter of contemporary art, and it's not something that I would be interested in giving up, right? And I think it's one of the ways that we also treat our audience as intelligent viewers, is to make work that's sophisticated and imagine that they're sophisticated enough to kind of understand and read it.
And how, I'm just curious, I don't want to go on and on, but like, how does that, Mark, relate to like what you said about class before?
Well, I don't think that poor people are any stupider than rich people. And, I think that they're also very sophisticated. And, I mean, the people I grew up with and went to school with who were not people of privilege are, have an incredibly sophisticated and complex and a sense of irony and humor, and have no problem reading irony. I sort of grew up in the sort of punk period where irony was really the lingua franca.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom, for that question. Let's jump. Philip had a question about Mark's titles. Philip, I'm going to unmute you right now.
I forgot what my question was. I have to go back and find it, but we could follow up on what they were talking about in the sense of asking whether, for Mark, whether the titles to his work are ironic. And I guess actually what I had asked before was whether or not you started with the ideas that were in the titles, or whether you started with the work and then gave them titles afterward, or what the relationship is between your words, as it were, and the works that you make.
My work has a really, especially my sculpture work, has a really precise kind of process, right? So it starts off with, ideas that then become drawings in my notebook, that then become a more finished drawing that I can translate and to people who are going to make it, which is usually myself and some other people. And then the actual materialization of the sculpture. So they're titled already, in pretty much that first stage, the notebook stage, which, for me, that's the most important stage. That's where I really work out all the ideas. So the titles they evolve at the same time as the drawing of the concept itself.
They contain ironic intentions.
They do contain ironic intentions. So very often the title will contradict what you're seeing, and
That's what, yes.
I certainly agree that
And what is your purpose in doing that?
I think the title is one of the ingredients of the work. It's one of, when it's a list of materials. Well, the title is one of those materials.
And having the title contradict the work.
I think the title can describe something that is not what your actual encounter is, right?
Of that.
I'm sorry?
And what is your purpose or intention in doing it that?
My intention is to create a challenging situation for the viewer, right? I want to make a work that is a bit of a puzzle that the viewer has to solve, I'm not interested in just sort of laying it out I don't want my viewers to be passive consumers of information, right? I want them to be active. I want them to be, I want to agitate them. I want to perplex them. I want to make them think. There's a lot of information in the world that one can passively consume. And that's exactly what art is not. Art is about an active engagement with ideas, with thoughts, it's about making meaning, but in a complex way.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Philip. We're gonna move. We got time for one more question. The username is Solidarity, but they had a question about the sixth stage of grief. Solidarity, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Yeah, you were talking about the 5 stages of grief, and I noticed that recently the official definition or those stages of grief have added a 6th one, which is meaning, which seemed very appropriate for your guys' work, because talking about extinction is only kind of valuable to people if you can find a way for us to absorb it. And I thought meaning and art seemed to go along so well, and I was wondering if you'd come across this or if that connects with anything you've thought about.
Well, to be clear, Mark and I were joking around about the Freudian 5 steps of grief. It wasn't using it literally. It was our sort of internalized relationship to it. So yeah, meaning could be included in that, certainly. I don't know what the meaning of extinction is, though.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
I kind of wish I had gone back and looked at the notes that Alexis and I wrote back when we were thinking about this. Alexis and I do a lot of interviews back and forth, and sometimes, like in filmmaking, a lot of the content ends up on the editing room floor. So I think that this was a section that we didn't actually articulate to a point where we wanted to publish it. But again, grief and mourning, melancholy, these are really my themes these days, and that's been the evolutionary arc of my work and practice.
Me 3.
Awesome. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you also to Speroni Westwater again for sponsoring this conversation. I want to point out that there's great dialogue going on in the chat, and I welcome everyone to read through there. There was more discussion about invasive species in art, and people have a lot of great links and names and recommendations, and we really appreciate the community and the exchange of knowledge that happens in the sidebar here. It really is feels very intimate, and we love that. Yes, you can download the chat with the ellipses.
Is there any way to the chat as a record? I'd be curious to see that.
Yeah, we download. Yeah, everyone can download it on their own computer. Also, we can download it and send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. We're gonna finish. Let's see. Well, this is the last one for the week. Thank you all for tuning in. We will have 5 more conversations next week. Stay tuned for the list. It will be published in our eBlast newsletter on Sunday. You can sign up for that through a link in the chat. And you can also pay attention to our social media where we keep everyone updated.
Thanks for a great job, John.
Thanks a lot. And thanks, Fong, for
and everyone
inviting
else.
us to making this
Thank you.
happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, and everyone that helped with it.
We're going to finish today, as is traditional, with a poetry reading from a staff member. I suppose staff member is not exactly the right word. We are blessed to have Fong Bui reading us a poem to close out the week. Fong, I'm going to give it over to you. Oh, I think we're trying to unmute you at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alexis, and thank you, Julie, and the question that follow. I just want to start sort of in response to Mark's remark earlier, why such exhibition of this urgent issue hasn't been really happening in our art community. Well, we sometimes have to do it because museums take too long to respond to anything. They need at least 4 or 5 years in advance. But I know that in June 1, 2017, when Trump pulled out the Paris Accord, along with other relentless insults and offenses in various immigration, human rights, international relations, of course, the environment, by October 17, the Railquay project undertook to curate a huge show, 50,000 square feet at Mana Contemporary, which also include both Mark's and Alexis' work in it. And from there on, we went on to undertake 2 simultaneous shows, Occupy Kobe, and also the ones at the last Venice Biennale as collateral project. Artists need to create on the same scale the society have the capacity to destroy, which is a neon work of the LA-based artist named Lauren Bond, which then became immediately the official banner of the Railquay project. So thereon, we are working, given the fact that if we get through this thing, a huge show will be Occupy Industry City. And that's solely focused on the environment issue. And again, 2 of your work will be prominently included, hopefully in March 2021. So we are working.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right, Fong. I mean, we have to do it ourselves. If the more official institutions won't do it, we will continue to do it our own way.
Yeah, and this show is going to be huge. It's going to be 160,000 square feet. So it will be the biggest show the Railquay project ever undertake. So anyway, thank you again. I'm going to read you guys a poem. Happened to be by Norma Cole, our luminous poet, the guest critic of this month's issue, because April is a poetry month. And just honoring Norma's incredible subject, it's called From the Dresden Floor. It's about various functions of the word threshold, which imply the intensity and the magnitude that must go beyond than what expected for a certain reaction, result, or phenomena to happen, to be revealed, to be manifested. And Norma brought in, I think, 14 friends. So I really urge you to read her guest critic pages. Thank you, Norma, you're listening. So I'm going to read this older poem of hers that was published by City Light in 2009 on the selected poems. It's called Forms of the Verb to Make Almost Always Include the I. Forms of the verb to make almost always include the I. For instance, the bird is watching the eye, or the eye is looking at the bird. Presence of the I in the text is witness to having done the other, is the stolen I. Remember, the eye is often in the hand, or is provided with the hand, which might introduce light, a double chandelier, permanent, ephemeral. The eyes is what touches things. Collusion, to doubt, is to touch, so the hand supports the eye. Being an eye, the hand can penetrate line or skin, surface or space, being in the eye, tending towards vision. Use, let it be a drawing, being careful. A word without color sense is opposed to the literal sense. Hidden in it, figure, a description of world with portrait in it. First geometry, then portrait, number, space, motion, gift, custom is our nature by nature. So different numbers imitate space, experience study. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks, Vaughn. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Alexis. Thanks,
so
Julie.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie, I hope we get a chance to meet face to face at some point.
I hope so too. Great to talk to both of you. Everybody stay
Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you. Thanks.
Have a great weekend, you guys.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Jason. Bye, Tom.
Bye, Tom. Bye, Aggie. Nice to see you. Hey, Sam. Bye, Sophia.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you, Aggie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aggie. Oh, so nice to see your face.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Kepler.
Oh, hey, Kepler.
Hey, Philip. Hey, Sam.
Kepler, did you enjoy the talk? Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Words. All right, bye, y'all.